Greetings, everyone. The Russia-Ukraine conflict has just reached a shocking turning point on the geopolitical chessboard. Pokrovsk, the strategic city where the Kremlin once loudly declared full control and intended to use as a launching pad to strangle Donbass, has now become a brutal meat grinder, trapping the main forces of Moscow. The number of Russian and Ukrainian soldiers killed in March and April was enormous. The fighting remains extremely fierce. Here are the latest analyses of today's key developments. The counterattack will break through the front line. The truth behind the Ukrainian army's sudden 3.3-kilometer thrust into the territory claimed by Russia has put the opponent's massive force of 99,000 troops in a dilemma. Why do international observers assert that Russia would have to sacrifice nearly 1.9 million soldiers if it wants to take the rest of Donetsk? What tragic pattern of losses is causing Putin's war machine to bleed every hour? With what hit-and-run tactics did Ukraine achieve an overwhelming victory in the drone war, burning down top-secret command centers and oil refineries up to 1,500 kilometers from the border to choke off the enemy's logistical lifeline? A historic turning point in the trenches when Kiev's offensives outnumbered Russian bombardments for the first time. Here is the content in detailed analysis. Ukraine will break through the Russian front, making a fierce 3.3 kilometers advance into Kharkov. Ladies and gentlemen, the battlefield is truly fierce. The fate of the strategic city of Kharkov was once thought to have fallen under the heel of the Russian army. Both observers and the Kremlin military command once believed that this fortified defensive center in the Donetsk region had to be firmly under their control, turning it into an ideal launching pad for Russian forces to push down and suffocate deeper areas inside Donbass. Battlefield situations are inherently unpredictable. A dramatic new chapter unfolded at the Kharkov hotspot as the Ukrainian army launched a sudden counterattack, breaking through the enemy's defenses by up to 3 kilometers. A sudden and deadly strike pushed the Russian military command into a completely passive position, exposing fatal gaps in a defensive system that had been touted as impenetrable. However, Kharkov is not just a spark this time, but a clear manifestation of an undercurrent that is shifting across the entire front line. By launching deep strikes combined with direct counterattacks, Ukraine is gradually regaining the initiative and shifting the momentum of the war. That determination is shown by shocking information from Mr. Sergei Brechuk, spokesperson for the Ukrainian volunteer forces. According to declassified data, the volunteer assault units have driven armored wedges deep into the Pokrovsk region, which was nominally under Russian control. Ukraine has breached the enemy's defensive layers, strongly countering the waves of reserve troops President Vladimir Putin is frantically sending to the battlefield. Those reserve recruits from Moscow, although large in number, are seriously lacking in both combat skills and psychological resilience to face the battle-hardened Ukrainian fighters. Kiev has just dealt a heavy blow to the Kremlin's strategic ambitions. On UATV, Mr. Sergei Brechuk commented that what just happened goes far beyond the scope of ordinary tactical actions. These are breakthrough attacks on the defensive lines. Although he could not disclose the exact coordinates due to top military security reasons, the spokesman still firmly asserted that at several spearheads, the Ukrainian army had penetrated up to 3 kilometers deep into the Russian defensive system. The most forceful statement, and also what the Kremlin fears most, is that this ambitious campaign is still underway. When Russia concentrated all its forces on the Donetsk front, they inadvertently created critical gaps, and Ukraine, with sharp tactical thinking, struck right at those weakest links. The overall picture of the breakthrough at Pokrovsk becomes even clearer through the real battlefield footage released by the 413th Regiment of Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces, also known as the Special Forces Regiment of Killers. On social media, images from unmanned aerial vehicles have captured scenes of precise, surgical strikes continuously raining down on a Russian command post. That is the headquarters of the 9th Independent Mechanized Infantry Brigade of the 51st Army of the Russian Federation, cleverly hidden in the ruins of a high-rise building in hopes of avoiding detection by the enemy's reconnaissance network. But modern positioning technology completely undermined that calculation. Each drone followed one after another, turning this fortified command center into a pile of burning rubble. The elimination of this command center is not just a local victory, but it will paralyze the ability to plan, coordinate operations, and break the subsequent offensives of the Russian army throughout the Donbass. The shockwaves did not stop at Pokrovsk. Military analysts believe this is a large-scale campaign that is spreading to other strategic areas such as Midor, Miranorat, Liman, and Konstantin Kostantaika. At these fiery coordinates, Ukrainian defense forces are bravely pushing back the enemy, gradually erasing the gains that the Russian army spent months and much blood to achieve by smashing Russian defensive lines right in what was considered a safe rear area. Ukraine is not only stopping Moscow's offensive, but also putting the Kremlin's entire plan to further annex Donetsk province into a state of serious paralysis. Faced with these dramatic developments, many people may be skeptical and wonder how such a scenario could happen when, for a long time, the Russian media machine loudly declared that Tukhtov had completely fallen and was under their absolute control. That is the fog of war that Putin and his allies deliberately created to deceive world opinion. Reality is always more complex and harsh than the Kremlin's bold statements. Going back in time, the chief of the Russian General Staff, General Valery Gerasimov, once confidently reported directly to President Putin and announced on the official Telegram channel that Tukhtov was firmly in Russian hands. Those calculated victory announcements were released at just the right time to create an advantage at the peace negotiations that took place immediately afterward. However, the curtain of lies was quickly torn apart. Right after Gerasimov's statements, the Institute for the Study of War, ISVKF, released independent analyses, confirming that there was absolutely no field evidence showing that Russia had taken control of Tukhtov. ISVKF even questioned the strategic value of this city for Russia's overall plan in Donetsk. To the west, north, and northeast of Tukhtov, Ukraine's solid fortification system and multi-layered defensive positions remain firmly in place, challenging all Russian attempts to advance. It is undeniable that Russian forces have made certain advances since then, and observers are under no illusion about a completely rosy situation for Ukraine on the Tukhtov front. However, things are not as easy or settled as some biased media outlets intentionally portray. Gunfire still echoes, and blood is still being shed in fierce battles right inside and around the city that Russia claims to have taken control of. The truth is revealed through data from General Oleksandr Zhirkai, Commander-in-Chief of the Ukrainian Army, when he pointed out that Russia had to concentrate a massive force of up to about 99,000 soldiers just in the Tukhtov direction alone. This is Russia's largest operational military grouping along the entire front line, stretching thousands of kilometers, a testament to the fact that the Kremlin is gambling heavily on this location. This massive buildup of troops was supposed to be deployed to break through the Donetsk defensive ring toward key strategic objectives, not to be bogged down in a prolonged battle. In reality, this situation has exposed two difficult geopolitical problems for the Kremlin. First, Tukhtov is by no means an ideal springboard for major offensives, as claimed by Vladimir Putin. If that were really the case, the 99,000-strong army could have pushed deeper into the center of Donetsk, helping Vladimir Putin get closer to his ambitious goal of capturing the entire Donbass region before the September deadline. Now, that deadline seems nearly impossible, especially as Ukraine strikes hard on the front lines.
Những đòn sấm sét ngay tại Pokrovsk.
Secondly, this massing of Russian troops shows the Russian command's extreme fear of a potential collapse of their lines and loss of territory. Now, Moscow is urgently setting up strong defensive lines right in an area they claim to have completely controlled. This self-contradictory action shows that their control is much more fragile and vulnerable than they are willing to admit. No matter how much the Kremlin tries to cover it up, Ukraine has proven to the whole world that they are more than capable of breaking the enemy's grip at Pokrovsk. The 3-kilometer counterattack is a purely geographical victory. But behind those blazing trenches, an even more terrifying danger is surrounding the Russian army. Just like the in-depth analyses and breakdowns we usually do about the global military situation, Putin's much bigger problem in Pokrovsk is that the devastating strikes deep into the rear are proving to be just as dangerous, if not more frightening, than the direct assaults on the front lines. Colonel Sergei Brachuk emphasized this to UATV news agency, saying that the strategic strikes deep into the temporarily occupied territories are significant. Attacking the enemy's logistical lifelines weakens their combat intensity and cripples Russia's ability to sustain its invasion. This mid-range campaign is spreading terror and weakening Russia's military across Donetsk. The devastating fire that burned down the brigade headquarters mentioned above is just the tip of the iceberg. According to analytical reports from The Independent, Ukraine is pouring massive resources into optimizing its deep strike capabilities, carrying out deadly airstrikes within a range of 30 to 180 kilometers behind enemy lines. Their targets are critical entities, command centers, mechanized vehicle formations, air defense batteries, and logistics depot systems. These attrition strikes, although they cannot immediately reverse the course of the war, are the key to opening up opportunities for ground counteroffensives. And the rapid advance at Pokrovsk is the fruit of this strategy. By using that generation of medium-range drones, Ukraine has devastated Russia's rear, leaving Russian soldiers on the front lines isolated, cut off from fire support, and completely severed from communication with their command. In that chaotic situation, as Russia's defense system lost its organization and became disjointed, Ukraine's elite units immediately surged forward, sweeping away the confused, scattered troops to penetrate deep into the enemy's defensive lines. Although Mr. Sergei Brachuk stated that these medium-range strikes cannot immediately reduce the frequency of Russian attacks, the actual situation in the near future could very well prove the opposite. The core issue here is this medium-range combat strategy. When skillfully combined with bold counterattacks and a solid defensive system that Ukraine has deployed throughout Donetsk, it is pushing the Russian army into a brutal war of attrition beyond their endurance. The crushing burden for Russian forces in Donetsk right now is having to make up for the horrific loss of life happening every hour. The daily casualty count for Russian troops constantly reaches nearly 1,000 killed and wounded. Due to the high cost, the Russian command must use strategic reserve forces for purposes that go against their original plan. Instead of using these troops as a spearhead to break through the Ukrainian lines, they have to use them as patches to mend the widening gaps on their own front. This harsh reality has been demonstrated at Pokrovsk, where the massive force of 99,000 troops suddenly lost its offensive edge as an expeditionary force and was turned into passive defensive units just trying to survive. This exhaustion is further highlighted by the telling numbers from General Oleksandr Zyrkoi in recent months, as he pointed out that Russia's casualty rate is about 3.5 times higher than Ukraine's across the entire front. Even during the most intense days, the death rate was even more staggering. With every Ukrainian soldier lost, 7 to 9 Russian soldiers fell on the battlefield. This brutal asymmetry is strong evidence that Putin's war machine is spiraling down an irrecoverable path. If we consider war as a harsh mathematical equation, then the field data from the Donbass front is pushing the Kremlin into a serious crisis regarding the sustainability of the entire campaign. According to analytical reports from the United 24 Media Agency, when looking at the cadastral map, the remaining 6,000 square kilometers that are so coveted will become a giant meat grinder. To swallow up this area, the Kremlin would have to sacrifice nearly 1.2 million troops, a number unimaginable for any war economy in the 21st century. In that context, the 99,000 troops that Russia has gathered at the Pokrovsk front suddenly seem extremely small and fragile. At the current rate of attrition, this force will be burned out in just a few short months, forcing Moscow to continuously pour new blood into a bottomless black hole, while the goal of controlling Donetsk remains far out of reach. This stalemate, combined with Ukraine's rapid counterattacks on the Pokrovsk front and devastating mid-range strikes, is turning a campaign that was expected to be decisive into one of Russia's worst strategic disasters. The exhaustion of Russia's war machine is not only reflected in the few meters of land gained, but is also starkly evident in the irreversible nature of its human losses. Unlike wounded soldiers who have a chance to recover and return to the trenches, those killed in action are a permanent loss to combat capability. Data from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense reveals a horrifying reality in just the months of March and April alone. The total number of Russian soldiers taken out of combat has reached nearly 70,000, with 35,203 killed and wounded in April alone. When applying the asymmetrical ratio announced by Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky, Ukraine's casualties during the same period were only around 20,000. Notably, the composition of Russia's losses is particularly tragic. President Volodymyr Zelensky once pointed out that up to 62% of Russia's losses are deaths, and only 38% are wounded. This means that in just 2 short months, 43,400 Russian soldiers have permanently fallen on the battlefield, a number more than twice the total casualties of the entire Ukrainian army combined. Colonel Serhiy Brat's warning about a breaking point that Russia's about to reach is completely grounded in scientific and practical reality. The death toll for Russian and Ukrainian soldiers is extremely high, and the war remains fierce. Mr. Pavlo Palisa, Deputy Chief of Staff to the President of Ukraine, stated that Donetsk remains the focus of Russia's desperate efforts as their failed spring offensive drags on into the summer. Putin's strategic intention is to establish a stable corridor from Pokrovsk as a launching pad to destroy strongholds, fortresses, and advance to the administrative border of Donetsk province. However, in reality, they have lost the bridge and have neither. Pokrovsk is shaking violently while Ukraine's fortresses still stand tall. This weakness is evidenced by a historic turning point revealed by General Oleksandr Tsiolkai through the Militani news agency. The Ukrainian Defense Forces have achieved a strategic balance in the number of attacks. At times, Ukrainian counterattacks outnumbered Russian offensives for the first time. This is an extraordinary and unbelievable achievement by Kyiv, completely breaking the pressure from the opponent's 99,000-strong army, forcing the Kremlin's forces into a defensive position and subjecting them to painful punitive strikes. To sustain the momentum of the counteroffensive and turn the achievements in Kokos into a large-scale liberation wave, Kyiv is carrying out groundbreaking military reforms to optimize the strength of the entire army. In an interview with Militani, Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Tsiolkai outlined a roadmap to enhance combat capabilities through new contract mechanisms, improve financial incentives, and standardize demobilization procedures for soldiers who have completed their service. In particular, special economic incentives will be prioritized for the most dangerous frontline assault positions, boosting the morale and bravery of the soldiers. The combination of these timely institutional reforms with the continuous reports of victories from the Pokrovsk front is creating an atmosphere of optimism. There is confidence in the complete shift of the axis and the momentum of the war toward Ukraine, laying a solid foundation for the deep operation plans that President Volodymyr Zelensky has approved for the next phase. The sharpest strategic weapon that is bleeding Russia's rear is the deep strike campaign using new-generation unmanned aerial vehicles. In his national address, President Volodymyr Zelensky affirmed that these long-range strikes are changing the battlefield situation by choking off the enemy's supply system and weakening their will to resist. In the occupied territories, FPV drones with a firing range extended beyond 70 kilometers are carrying out a strategy of harassment, destroying air defense positions, and opening up the entire sky for subsequent air raids. The scale of this war is so great that the Atlantic Council think tank has had to admit that Ukraine is achieving an overwhelming victory in the drone war. Not stopping there, Kyiv has launched hundreds of drones through heavy air defense fire to strike directly at the centers of Donau, Moscow, and other regions deep inside Russia. A typical example is the devastating raid targeting the Pole oil refinery, which is located up to 1,500 kilometers from the border. The continuous explosions at seaports and strategic oil refineries in May have destroyed the Kremlin's most important financial source, while also cutting off fuel supplies to the army groups engaged in combat. Peace negotiations are nearly stalled. Russia maintains military pressure as Ukraine tries to sustain its combat capability with drones, Western aid, and strikes on Russian rear areas. How long will this war continue?